Hello, this is Chris Jansen. Welcome to the End Evil podcast.
It was a crazy year, 2020. I think everybody kind of was losing their mind one way or another. But if you're listening to this, you made it through.
And they're making mistakes, and people are starting to awake.
There is a science of human freedom.
It's also a spiritual journey.
A person under hypnosis will start to see that there's something wrong. Something is wrong.
It's great that you know what you've come to know, but until there's an outlet for that information and you start creating and putting your creations out into the world to teach other people so that they can become as knowledgeable as you.
Life. What is encouraging life is good. That which takes away from life and growth and creativity is not good.
Hello, this is Leslie Powers back again with Alive and Thriving, Part 5. Awaken your true human potential by taking responsibility for your personal psychology, lifestyle choices, and holistic health. Claim your sovereign freedom and free your soul as you are guided by natural law and right moral action. This is for people on the path of awakening. Please have an open mind. And if you haven't yet seen parts 1 through 4, start at the beginning because each edition builds on the other previous to it. So I want to review a little bit and talk about empathy. Empathy is not the problem. We talked in the last episode about this dynamic that can sometimes happen between the narcissist and what is often called the empath. And at the end of the presentation, I said it's really not about empathy being the problem, but it's about people who are not using proper discernment and not protecting themselves due to a certain naivete, believing that other people think and feel and care the way that they do. So empathy is not the problem. Empathy is a good thing, for it is the emotional power that connects us, and it creates caring relationships with other people. In many ways, it is the basis of our survival and thriving in life. Empathy is necessary to grow healthy, emotionally secure children through the building of secure developmental attachments. It is a glue that binds people in communities. However, assuming that other people operate from the same emotional perspective and motivation as you do can become a big problem. When you assume others think like you set yourself up for exploitation and abuse. This abuse and exploitation can happen at all levels, from a person in your immediate circle that you interact with on a daily basis to systems in the world that we've taken for granted as just the way they are. There are many people who do not operate from empathy, but instead from self-serving motivations of power and control or financial benefit. This dynamic within an individual is typically created through severe or prolonged developmental trauma, where needs for a safe and loving connection were not met in childhood. When early childhood relationships in children's lives are disrupted or unsafe, and emotional needs are for safety and protection are not met, some kind of relational disruption is likely to occur later in life. This can result in the patterns of narcissism or codependency, enabling cycles of abuse often continue when childhood trauma is not processed and healed. Adults with unresolved trauma wounds may be vulnerable to being in either abusive or victimized roles in adulthood, or become an abuser themselves. People often operate and perpetuate these dysfunctional cycles unconsciously. So do you remember towards the end of part 1, I asked you to create a vision of the future beyond your death, a time when you are imagining a thriving society for future generations. So this was a call to imagine a better world. And in this world, I hope that it includes freedom through the recognition of every individual's natural rights, and one that values every individual and promotes his or her gifts and potentials. A world where every living person can thrive. Can you envision a society where people value themselves and each other and accept their own personal responsibility to live according to natural law, moral principles, so that all persons' rights to consensual relationships are preserved? How would such a community or society approach narcissism? How would individuals respond to the wrongdoings of others? How would people protect and defend themselves against abusive treatment? What kind of emotional skills and self-mastery would each person need to learn? Is there a place for government in such an ideal society? I'll be talking more about this and proposing the idea that we cannot have government in this ideal society, for government can't exist without the abuse of power. What would you want to teach children about such matters so that they grow up to be confident, capable, and wise? How do we move in this direction now so that this vision can manifest to reality in the future? Let's keep moving forward with some key concepts to help us. In this part 5, we'll touch on the subjects of true anarchy, sovereignty, our unlimited potential, the resistance that we have to change, denial, anger, letting go, self-healing, personal responsibility, overcoming addictions, self-resourcing, and doing the great work. The fear of freedom, where does it come from? Mark Passio states that this fear of freedom comes from a refusal to own personal responsibility, and that this is also related to individuals having self-loathing due to a lack of self-respect or a perceived value, a lack of value about themselves, and abandonment issues. So in short, what he's proposing here is that through early experiences that children develop a self-loathing perspective about themselves, that utterly see themselves as unworthy or of lower value and do not grow up with a sense of self-respect that allows them to naturally be protective of themselves and their rights. And early abandonment often is a cause for this damaged self-assessment, this self-esteem that results in feeling powerless or hopeless or a victim or dependent on others, unworthy. And with that psychological framework, there's often a deflection of responsibility or a feeling of powerlessness. So this fear of freedom is related to our feeling states and the perceived threats to our safety, and a fear perhaps of even losing oneself or one's life. Our goal here is to become the magician, for each of us to embody our value and our power. So in the tarot, the qualities of the magician could include this: self-energy, being very solid and calm in oneself, being curious, having clarity, feeling connected to the universe, being courageous and confident, creative and compassionate. Those are the qualities of self-energy as defined in a mental health therapeutic model called internal family systems. And from Michael Tsarian's The Path of the Fool, the teroscopic meanings of the 78 arcana, he claims that the magician is related to the concepts of coming into our own, autonomy of thought and action, independent decision-making, willpower, concentration, discovery and revelation, occult studies, synthesis, and unification. So hold these qualities in mind as markers for your own personal growth. Alignment of one's thoughts, emotions, and actions provides us with dominion over ourselves. The goal is not power over others, but instead dominion and power over oneself in combination with the quality of care, true care or love, agape. And this dominion over self combined with love is part of the three-part equation with freedom. So when we have dominion over self, love and care, and freedom, then that creates order instead of chaos. For this to occur, one must have integration or alignment between your thoughts, feelings, and actions. It's the triad of power. So this would result in what we're calling internal monarchy, and this comes with external anarchy. So this is an important concept that often receives resistance. So let's talk more about this. Potentially, most every developing child and adult can learn to master their own internal mental and emotional state, to discipline their physical impulses, and to live according to moral principles. This is internal monarchy. We are free to act as long as we do not cause harm to another. And in order not to cause harm to another, we must have a very deep understanding of ourself and the skills to regulate our emotion, to see things in perspective, and to control our behavior. The skills required are self-awareness, self-reflection, emotional intelligence, the ability to emotionally regulate, the understanding of right from wrong, the attitude of personal responsibility, a commitment to living by the non-violence principle, to know how and to be willing to defend oneself when necessary. It will involve respect for every individual's rights as equal to our own. It will involve holistic health habits to keep our body and mind sharp and optimally tuned, communication skills and personal expression abilities, reflective listening, problem solving, time management, and the ability to use critical thinking, as we've described as being aware of the trivium process. So take a look at these skills and notice where you're strong and where you might be a little bit weaker, and that will give you a direction to go. So if we have internal monarchy, then we can learn to live peacefully and harmoniously in a state of external anarchy, meaning that we don't have external rulers, and we don't need them because we know right from wrong, and we have the internal knowledge and the external control to live congruently with morality. All the skills are learnable. The added requirement is to care. Care comes from the ability to have empathy and recognize that all people are connected and in essence one under a universal power, or what many would call God. Care keeps self-serving interests in check. So the real definition of anarchy is different than what you see on the news. The word anarchy is derived from the Greek prefix an, meaning without, the absence of, and the Greek noun archon, meaning ruler or master. Anarchy does not mean without rules. It literally means without rulers. No rulers, no masters. Again, internal monarchy, external anarchy. This involves developing mastery over ourselves. That is the goal. The goal is internal, personal empowerment. rather than giving over our power to an external source and in sitting in a state of victimhood or dependency. Anarchy is the freedom from external rulers. If people learn to live as guided by natural law, then internal monarchy results. Natural law comes from nature. It is God-given. It is existing, eternal, timeless, and universal. All people receive consequences to their actions, and we are, as humans, responsible for those decisions. No external coercion or additional human-made laws or governance would be necessary in a world where people are taking responsibility for their own decisions and seeking to be in harmony with natural law. And we would have the naturally granted right to protect and defend ourselves and to participate in exchanges with other people on a voluntary basis. Not a coerced basis, but a voluntary basis. Under the non-aggression principle, people would have the motivation and direction to solve problems using peaceful means. Recognizing their interdependence, people would respect each other's rights and aspire to work together. If one's rights are violated, then individuals have the right to self-defense, and this knowledge would help keep people's impulses in check. Personal responsibility underlies everything. If people continue to look outward for some person or group to guide them, to make decisions for them, then essentially they are stunting their emotional and spiritual growth and limiting their human potential and personal power. We handicap ourselves by abdicating our personal responsibility. This is a quote by Lee Wrights. Anarchy is not the chaos that media portrays, showing riots or looting or lawlessness. Those are the things that happen under every government in history, usually as a reaction to some act of bureaucracy. Anarchy is actually peaceful people being left alone to rule their own lives while leaving others alone to do the same. And I would add that it also involves learning how to peacefully and fairly get along with others, because our lives are dependent on others. There's an interdependence that we have in reality. Anarchy is the absence of slavery, which is the erroneous claim of ownership of another person, their property, or the fruits of their labor. Logan Hart from the Wizard Factory. So we do not require rulers or external authorities. Let this sink in. We do not require rulers or external authorities. We are sovereign. Sovereign means we are not a slave. A sovereign is a monarch, mon, one, archon, ruler. A single ruler who rules only the kingdom of self. Clearly, we cannot control ethically another person. All we can control are our own thoughts, our own actions. We can influence our emotional state, but it's an inside job. And the only domain that we have right, the only domain that we have a right to act upon really is our own domain, ourself. Sovereignty is a state in which one controls one's thoughts, emotions, and actions. And by bringing them into unity or non-contradiction, non-duality, we attain mastery over our own consciousness. Self-control equals self-mastery equals self-ownership, not a slave. We are sovereign beings. Our spiritual potential is sovereignty. And I think our purpose is to become fully sovereign in our self-expression, because our potential is unlimited. So stop limiting yourself. What stops us from living up to our full potential? Well, first, let's talk about the difference between nescience and ignorance. It's the context of not knowing. Nescience is from the Latin verb nesciere, to not know because knowledge was absent or unattainable. So a child who is not given access or freedom to information is reasonably described as nescient. They didn't have the opportunity or access. But most of us, once we reach adulthood and teenage, even teen years, we have access through this amazing process of internet searching and books and the ability to consult with a variety of people. It's pretty endless. And so most of us are operating from ignorance rather than nescience. Ignorance comes from the Latin verb ignorare, to not know, even though necessary information is present, because that information has been willfully refused or disregarded. So ignorance involves ignoring information and choosing to put blinders on, choosing not to look. We'll talk more about that as we go. Our society or culture does not inform children or adults about their psychology or teach them how to process and heal. Instead, we are propelled into a culture of dependency on so-called experts to fix our ills, mostly with pharmaceuticals that mostly serve as band-aids and that do not heal the causes of problems at the root. Oftentimes, the very prescription causes individuals more harm than good. The systems in place perpetuate dependency on external systems and actively discourage people from pursuing self-knowledge and the responsibility for their own healing or their own independence. The so-called helping systems, mostly government-run, are greatly responsible for the perpetuation of the sustained and worsening suffering of people. Through government, we have fraud, abuse of power, corruption, exploitation, abuse of money, self-serving agendas, the violation of human rights, and it doesn't get better. Therefore, we must be vigilant and discerning in all our interactions, including relationships with so-called helping programs or public education systems, especially when run by the government. We must stop being so trusting and stop giving the benefit of the doubt. While many frontline workers in government programs or medical centers may be well-meaning and kind, they are working in a system where they are frequently misled or even coerced or threatened to toe the line, a line that is dictated from the top down by self-serving and greedy narcissists. It's time for good and caring, well-meaning people to get stronger in their self-defense and in their courage to stop participating in systems that are using them. Because when you work for an agency or a government system and you are ignoring the harm that's being done by that institution, then you are part of the harm doing. You're part of the wrongdoing, and you're part of creating harm. And if you're doing so for a paycheck or for retirement or for so-called security, you're out of alignment within yourself. It creates dissonance, cognitive dissonance, which really does wreak havoc on our personal system. It doesn't create peace or happiness when we are in internal misalignment. What else stops us? The belief in authority. Authority is a false religion. Authority is an illusion born out of mind control, based entirely in violence, and built upon the erroneous and dogmatic belief that some people are masters who have the moral right to issue commands, and others are slaves who have a moral obligation to obey the masters. This is false. No one is born a slave in nature. It is only human constructs and social constructs that put an overlay onto nature that tell children that they are less than or lower than other people, and that certain people have a right to more privileges and can be take authority over them. Okay, and we grow up with this belief system through school, through the news, through the politics, through our interactions with our parents and the things that are passed down from them. And I'm here to say, no, this is false. That authority has become a religion, and that's false. What is religion? From the Latin verb relegare, to tie back, to hold back, to thwart from forward progress, or to bind. A false religion is a system of control based in unchallenged dogmatic belief. Dogmatic belief which holds back the progress of consciousness. It's actually power and control masked as spirituality. Control efforts masked or cloaked as righteousness. But in reality, most religions, including the religion of authority, the religion of money, things we worship, right, that they are actually binding us, holding us back, thwarting our progress. The bottom line, government is slavery. Think about that. No, it's not putting us in chains or cages, but spiritually, mentally, psychologically, and in effect, we are being bound. We are being limited and thwarted through government based on a false belief of authority that certain people or groups of people have the right to make decisions on our behalf, and that we don't have the right to say no to. It takes away our independent right to choose through efforts of violence and coercion. Watch out for the techniques of cults, the techniques of false religions, or in other words, how to brainwash willing followers who want to give away personal responsibility for their actions. This is done through isolation, the pressure of conformity, the indoctrination through repetition, and through causing trauma. Why do we resist the truth? Why do we resist positive change? Why? Well, let's look at some reasons. Expectations from others affect us. We have internalized shoulds. You should do this, you should do that. You shouldn't ever argue with a teacher. Do what your boss says. We have unconscious programming from our families, the media, culture, and overall societal norms. And this programming keeps us very devoted to things that are false. We have our sacred cows that we dare not even challenge. There's a lot of pressure to conform, and people dislike criticism. They dislike feeling attacked. There's internalized shame, threats of alienation or rejection by your culture, your group, your community. Anxiety can create fears of catastrophe, fears of great loss to your security and safety. Gaslighting as a technique used against people can result in us doubting our own perceptions, thoughts, or conclusions. Insecurity about our own power, the power of our intelligence, or our sense of personal agency. Many people develop learned helplessness and feel hopeless and helpless to make change, to impact the bigger world. There's generational suffering, and this very tempting tendency to accept the pain body as true, to feel safe within that pain body of generational wounding. We have internal and external conflicts and competing values and desires. We fear pain, and we sometimes choose to stay asleep because waking up is too frightening or too painful. Self-doubt, a pattern of thought and behavior that develops in us from a young age. It can make us freeze. Doubts about being able to count on other people, problems with trust, having had bad experiences with other people as being untrustworthy. Oftentimes we have worldviews that really interfere with the truth, and we cling to those worldviews rather than let them be disrupted to see something new. And in general, there's just a great fear of the unknown. Fear itself is maybe the one-word answer to these questions. We have resistance to the steps towards our own freedom. We all resist something. We even resist believing the truth because it feels threatening, right? We resist positive changes because even good change can be frightening. We resist believing that something better is possible because our doubts are fueled by fear of losing that which we know and feel secure in. Be honest with yourself about your own fears that create resistance. You know, we all have an instinctual drive for survival. It's wired into our brains and nervous systems. This instinctual drive has been and is continuing to be exploited by the powers of authority interfering in our lives. And when we feel threatened, we seek safety. Safety is associated at a basic level with belonging to a tribe or a community, having approval. We just simply have a drive to fit in. Even the nonconformists of the world have a drive to fit in somewhere, to find their tribe, to be accepted, and to have protection in a group. It's pretty basic desire to feel normal somehow. And what is familiar gets associated with a sense of safety. And without that group, we risk death and we feel a loss of protection. We seek to avoid pain and to avoid death. We fear loss. We fear the unknown. We fear rejection, abandonment, shame, or ridicule. We develop internal and external defenses to secure our sense of internal safety. So we become guarded, defensive. Defenses include externalization, externalizing issues, denial, minimizing, projection, avoidance, self-pity. We develop thinking errors. These templates of defense are often not even conscious. They can be deeply embedded in our nervous system, the limbic system of our brain, our genes and DNA. They become installed and embedded as a result of chronic stress or trauma. History of individual, familial, ancestral trauma often forged these templates of fear and defense. So look at your own resistance to any topic, anything that I've said, anything that is challenging your sense of security around the idea of claiming your sovereignty and disabling on some level the dependency on government. So what are you resisting? What ideas seem impossible to you? What positive changes are you resisting? What lifestyle habits are you defending? What makes you feel unsafe? From Lawrence Wasson, Mitch Wasson. His website is theprincipleofcare.com. His slide talks about feeling. We are where we are because we have been conditioned to disregard, ignore, and or run away from all perceived threats or signs of danger. In many cases today, the perceived threat or danger is the truth. And yet the irony of this is that the truth will truly set us free and is of true value. And oftentimes that which we're clinging to and perceiving as safety is actually a threat to our very freedom and our very sovereignty. One emotion, one feeling that often comes up on this journey of awakening to truth is anger. And we can get quite fiery. As this little guy says, don't roast marshmallows on my head. Anger is fuel, and it can really get us explosive. And many people have a really hard time with anger and are uncomfortable expressing it, or uncomfortable with the power of it, and don't know what to do with it. So we need to learn how to consciously direct our emotional energy. And anger is a powerful emotion, and it's a crossroads emotion that really brings us, it's a pivot point from the sense of powerlessness and helplessness to being empowered and taking action. Yoda once said, fear is a path to the dark side. And this can include the dark side of anger, where anger is fueled by fear. Anger can lead to hate, and hate to suffering. I think this full Yoda quote says, the fear is a path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering. However, anger in itself is not bad. Consciousness of anger and conscious direction of energy of anger can allow anger to be a very empowering emotion. Overcoming our discomfort and fear of anger is important. Anger is a signal. It tells us something. Anger is a motivator. Channel the power of anger into right action based on moral principles. Use anger consciously and wisely for a purpose. Transmute anger from poison to medicine. How can you translate the raw emotional power of anger into an honorable action? The goal here is to become the driver of your own emotions and see anger as a power of change. Anger comes from our spirit of self-preservation. It is when we perceive a threat to ourself, to our own well-being. It's the healthy aspect of our ego that says we have rights. We have a right to be treated right. And when we're treated wrong, there's naturally a feeling of anger. And this can be a mechanism to propel us into a strategy for positive change, a strategy to move us towards freedom and well-being and happiness. So ask yourself, what is the intention for the use of my anger? Express your anger with your frontal lobes turned on, with your frontal lobes online when possible. Otherwise, you're just driven from the animal part of the brain and the limbic system, the reptile part of the brain. The brainstem, the limbic system, which would be the mammalian part of the brain, and the brainstem, which is the reptile part of the brain. The frontal lobes, the neocortex, is what makes us uniquely human, and it's our gift to be able to operate from this balance of left and right hemispheres, that this part of our brain that has the ability to keep perspective and to think, to witness ourselves and to think about our emotions, to think about cause and effect. And if we are in an extreme stress response, our frontal lobes, they turn down, they don't work good. And then we operate strictly from the emotional power without being harnessed or driven consciously. So we need to learn how to calm down the emotional animal within us to be able to activate our human thought process. And there are ways to do this. So we want to express our emotions, especially our anger, with our frontal lobes turned on. Self-defense is an appropriate application of anger under pressure when our rights are being threatened. Our fight or flight response can be associated with a sense of threat to our well-being, and anger can be used righteously in self-defense. It can give the appropriate energy and power to save our own life or to save the life of our loved ones. So from Spider-Man, my favorite line, with great power comes great responsibility. And our emotions, our power, we can activate them for good ends, for good purpose. But we got to deal with our denial. We all have some level of denial. So let's look at this. The denial is what creates ignorance. It leads to us covering our heads and not looking, not taking action. So here are some quotes about denial. You'd be surprised what lengths people will go to not to face what's real and painful inside them. So again, we don't look because we fear our own pain, our own emotional pain. We've not been taught typically how to tolerate and manage emotional pain. So we have these defenses and we go to great lengths not to face our pain. Denying what you feel will not make it go away. It ensures that it never gets resolved. That's important. We can deny our feelings, we can deny the painful situation, and we can compartmentalize it and stuff it down. But I'll tell you this, that will not solve your problem. It will not resolve the problem. It will not go away. Problems that you bury will raise their heads one way or another and usually wreak havoc and chaos in your life and have you feeling out of control. A person who lives in denial will paint a picture of themselves as being the victim or innocent in all aspects. They will be offended by the truth, but what is done in the dark will come to light. Time has a way of showing people's true colors. Denial is the shock absorber for the soul. It protects us until we are equipped to cope with reality. A quote by C.S. Lewis. So that is a compassionate insight about denial. That reminds us that denial is a result of a wounding, a pain, a fear, and that when our conscious mind is not feeling prepared or is not integrated in its parts, that we protect ourselves. We have parts of us that protect ourselves from what feels like an unbearable awakening. And so that part, the denial becomes a part of us that is there to somehow protect us and yet backfires. And we can see that when we're able to step back and detach from this part, right? This defense system, and start activating our frontal lobes to think rationally, to discern properly, and to develop a strategy that puts us in alignment with our sovereignty. Anything unresolved within our energy field will keep manifesting itself in our life until we heal it. You can run, but you can't hide. If you are out of alignment within yourself or with truth, then you will not have true peace. Peace will be fleeting. And you will continue to run after external things to try to distract and cover up and, protect you from the truth, but you won't have peace. You will perpetuate your own suffering. This happens when we choose to stay with our fear rather than let go of it, so we stay afraid. Sometimes we reject facts and reasoning to perpetuate the illusion of safety and use defenses such as denial, minimization, or projection to remain in ignorance. So here this little bear says, I'm not in denial. I'm just choosy about which reality I prefer to live in. And this is where we say you have to let go of the dreaming in the context of a false narrative about reality. The truth is what is. And we sugarcoat a lot of things, and we tell stories about a lot of things that are just trying to keep us feeling good because we're afraid to look at the truth. And this will never, in the long run, be good. It will not result in good things. So we must do some letting go of fear and resistance. We need to let go of addictions and dependencies. So here are some examples of types of behavior addictions. Internet and games, debt, shopping, workaholism, losing ourselves in love, loving the feeling of falling in love, sexual addictions, gambling, food and eating addictions, codependencies. And that's on top of what we typically think of as addictions to various substances. There are behavioral addictions as well that are very common. Addiction to being on social media, Addiction hijacks a person's mind and it takes over your consciousness. Addiction leads to the development of internal conflict and cognitive dissonance. It's a way of taking yourself offline from being the master of your own castle, your own internal castle. You're not, controlling the horse that you're riding anymore. You're letting the horse just lead you, to wherever he wants to go. Harm reduction is a step, but not a solution. In the treatment of addiction, the big trend right now is harm reduction. And I find it to be frustrating because they associate that a lot with medicated treatment, which can be a stepping stone to true sobriety and freedom from addiction. But there is a tendency, there is a trend right now saying that it's really okay just to stay in harm reduction and to stay dependent on medications or structures. And it really is in denial of a person's spiritual potential to transcend and transmute addiction and dependency. It encourages people to give up and to accept themselves as less than their potential. So I'm not a big fan of harm reduction as a long-term goal. True freedom includes freedom from addiction, of all kinds of addiction. Guarding yourself against external forces that seek to control, exploit, or seduce you in a certain behavior pattern is vital to your health. And addiction, I think, is being promoted, being encouraged, in a way to keep control over people, to keep them dependent on pharmaceuticals, to keep them distracted and small. Media and modern technology trends are modes of control of the human mind due to how they hijack our nervous system and natural pleasure circuitry. The brain on dopamine. Feeling pleasure is a natural motivator for human survival. Pleasure motivates us to repeat patterns which are life-sustaining, such as eating, having sex, exercising. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter which is present in the parts of the brain that regulate movement, emotion, motivation, and feelings of pleasure. The human brain is designed so that we get a reward or dopamine surge when we engage in life-sustaining acts by creating a sense of pleasure, satisfaction, or reward when doing them. Repetition of such activities is encouraged by the pleasure and thus activates a reward circuit involving the repetition of life-perpetuating behaviors. Dopamine also guides the brain to associate importance to life-sustaining activities, Therefore, the more powerful the experience, the louder the message of importance, and the stronger the desire is to repeat the activity. So you can think about how a substance or an activity that creates a big dopamine surge can be very self-reinforcing and very powerful, and can be self-sustaining because it is associated unconsciously with survival, with the sustenance of life itself. And so our brains can be hijacked, and thus our behaviors manipulated if we're not aware and conscious and determined to change these patterns of external manipulation. So beyond dopamine, substances impact the way our nervous system manages information by influencing its communication system. The key elements of such communication are neurotransmitters such as dopamine, serotonin, GABA, acetylcholine, epinephrine, norepinephrine, and endorphins. Certain substances release dopamine at 2 to 10 times greater than the brain does under natural circumstances. So substances, natural substances or drugs, may release dopamine from 2 to 10 times more than our brain does naturally under natural life-sustaining activities, such as exercise. Okay. The likelihood that a particular drug will lead to addiction is strongly tied to the rate at which dopamine is released and the intensity and duration of that release. If an individual continues to consume the addictive substance or engage in the addictive behavior, such as compulsive sex, for example, the brain adapts to the artificially high levels of dopamine and stops producing dopamine naturally, or it reduces the number of dopamine receptors. So then it becomes much harder for a person to enjoy life in its natural form, in its unartificially altered form. This leads to a person receiving less pleasure through natural behaviors in life. With repeated flooding of the brain with dopamine, the natural brain reward circuit can collapse, ultimately causing low dopamine function, intense cravings, and diminished ability to perceive pleasure without the substance. This can lead to a vicious cycle of addiction, a physiological addiction. And then there's another way to look at substance abuse, another factor to add into this complex experience of addiction. Self-loathing and shame can be both a root and a maintainer of addictive behaviors. Joanne Hari quotes, "The opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. And our whole society, the engine of our society, is geared towards making us connect with things, not people. If you are not a good consumer, capitalist citizen, if you're spending your time bonding with the people around you and not buying stuff. In fact, we are trained from a very young age to focus our hopes and our dreams and our ambitions on things we can buy and consume. And drug addiction is really a subset of that." A quote by Bruce Alexander, "It's not your morality, it's not your brain, it's your cage. Addiction is largely an adaptation to your environment." So let's think about this angle, that our environment is like a cage that keeps us captive. And that addiction can be an adaptation to being locked up, to being enslaved, to being in an environment that tries to extinguish the flame of our spirit, that thwarts us from our true independent and creative path, that tries to stop us from being the magician in our own life. And this discouragement, this spiritual discouragement, can lead to hopelessness and addiction through the experience of pleasure and satisfaction and perceived fulfillment. We seek fulfillment, right? But we're doing it in the wrong places. We're spinning on the wrong wheel. We've created a society where significant numbers of our fellow citizens cannot bear to be present in their lives without being drugged, right? Even if it's a prescribed drug. We have more people on drugs than we do sober. If you're looking at not just, on illegal so-called drugs, but pharmaceutical prescribed drugs. We've created a hyper-consumerist, isolated world that is, for a lot of people, much more like an empty cage, devoid of the true sustenance and nourishment of the spirit, of connection with the people, from connection to one's purpose and one's true self. Gabor Mate, a well-known psychiatrist, in his book, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, Close Encounters with Addiction, says this: not all addictions are rooted in abuse or trauma, but I do believe they can all be traced to painful experience. A hurt is at the center of all addictive behaviors. It is present in the gambler, the internet addict, the compulsive shopper, and the workaholic. The wound may not be as deep and the ache not as excruciating, and it may even be entirely hidden, but it's there. As we'll see, the effects of early stress and adverse experiences directly shape both the psychology and the neurobiology of addiction in the brain. It is impossible to understand addiction without asking what relief the addict finds or hopes to find in the drug or the addictive behavior. And lastly, he quotes, the attempt to escape from pain is what creates more pain. So defining addiction as just a medical condition is not adequate. We must take personal responsibility for our own healing. And it's important that we really consider this factor of person in situation. And as in Don Miguel Ruiz's book, The Four Agreements, we can remind ourselves that we need to do our best. And our best will vary depending on the situation and our condition and the state of our health and the state of our mind at any given moment. And it is our responsibility to attune to ourself, our own needs, and to learn the skills to be able to improve the conditions of our body, our mind, and our environment. So the various influences on our lives and our situations include things like economics, the norms of our culture, our adult role models, the political environment, the neighborhood we're living in, our family history, the history of our culture, our ethnicity, right? The media that we're exposed to, the man-made laws that are infringing upon us, our church or religious affiliations, our work setting, our peer group, our education, what we're exposed to in a school or educational system, the knowledge that we have access to that we pursue, our family, our spouse, and all of these are circles outside of ourselves that we have inner relationship with, that we have some interdependence that create a soup that impacts us. And then we could look at things like, are you well rested? Are you well nourished? Are you hydrated? Are you having, conflicts in your life, right? These are all situational. The different kinds of traumas that we've experienced, the hardships, the stressors on any given day. So this calls for us to be compassionate with ourselves and with others as we go forward on this journey, to operate from a place of care, to cultivate empathy, and recognizing that we've all been wounded, that we're all subject to a lot of toxins and pressures and difficult responsibilities that complicate our path here as we're trying to untangle from these things that are not helping us, helping our world. We are all connected at a higher spiritual level, and this is important to stay aware of. And hurting another is akin to hurting oneself and future generations. So having this compassion, cultivating respect for ourselves and others is important. So again, looking at this idea of person in environment or person in situation comes from a woman named Florence Hollis, 1964, in the social work field. So our situation, our environment can create stresses in a person's physical, social, and psychological reality, as well, and create the social realities that define and limit us at any particular time. And a lot of the limitations are ingrained in us as truths when in fact they're fallacies, when it's the result of mind control. So we have to acknowledge that a lot of our imposed limitations are fallacies. Person environment, though, examines both the personal and the social aspects of all problems, be they social problems or personal ones. So we don't live in isolation. And as we're untangling this complex web, we realize that there is a person in a context and that we affect each other. And so my freedom is affected by your behavior and vice versa. Conscious action springing from knowledge. This is how our reality is built. Our reality is built through conscious action springing from knowledge. So it starts at the bottom of the structure, the bottom level of our building, with knowledge. The knowledge we have or the lack of knowledge. So the available information constitutes potential knowledge that may be gathered, processed, understood, and acted upon by individuals. So access to knowledge is important. The willingness to seek knowledge is important. The valuing of truth is the foundation of how our reality is built. And then there's understanding or a lack of understanding. And this includes decision-making processes. These processes take place in the human mind and are chosen by each individual based on the available information. So you have knowledge, and then you make a decision. And then there's wisdom, knowledge, understanding, wisdom, or lack of. Equates to human behavior. Our behavior is an embodiment of our wisdom. It is an expression of the wisdom that we've gained through knowledge and understanding. Each individual's behavior is based on the quality of their decision-making processes, which in turn are based on the quality of their available information. And this creates the manifested reality. The quality of the condition which manifests in a society is based upon the aggregate quality of the behavior in that society. That is the generated result, which could be orderly or chaotic. And this addresses both the manifestation process as an individual, but even more so the recognition that the manifestation in our environment involves the behavior of everyone around us, everyone whose behavior impacts us. And this emphasizes and highlights how important knowledge is and truth and access to information, and why censorship and occulting of knowledge is the biggest problem, one might say. It's one of the biggest problems, if not the biggest problem. And people's unwillingness to look at knowledge and to question their ingrained beliefs is a big problem. That said, we may be feeling angry at ourselves for the mistakes we've made in our past, the ways that we've self-sabotaged or perpetuated our own enslavement, our own cage. And we may be mad at other people too, for their ignorance, for their denial. And this is a big thing for us to grapple with. And I do believe that there is an aspect here where we have to have some forgiveness, forgive ourselves, and focus on self-healing. So from Michael Tsarian in Psychic Self-Defense, the healing process concludes once you make a distinct point of forgiving yourself for past foolishness and lack of boundary. Focus on the lessons learned and wisdom received from your experience of evil. Betrayal of self eventually resulted in the strengthening of selfhood. So take a deep breath, forgive yourself, and move on. Wherever you're at in this process of awakening, I'm sure you can look back now and see things that you regret and see how you were entangled in the structures of evil, perhaps entangled into addiction. And if you keep beating yourself up, that will get in the way of your freeing yourself. So there is a point here of forgiving yourself and seeing the lessons that you can learn from your life thus far, make amends with yourself and the people in your life, and chart a new course towards freedom and truth and sovereignty and internal monarchy. Embrace the true definition of external anarchy by taking your personal responsibility for your own happiness and do the work it takes to do the healing so that you are free. And then we all together, unified through this great work, can influence others. And then we become powerful together. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The latter procedure, however, is disagreeable and therefore not popular. A quote by Carl Jung. We need to look into the dark places of ourselves and the world we live in. This is the end of part 5 of Alive and Thriving. I look forward to seeing you in my next installment, part 6. My website is alivethrive.life. Released from trauma, guided by principles, empowered by freedom. Please look me up if you're interested in life coaching, or in the state of California if you're interested in mental health counseling. I'm really happy to work with people in the truth and freedom movement and help you on your journey. Have a good day. Hey guys, I thought